Hi, and welcome back to It's Not Rocket Science 5 Questions Over Coffee. I'm really delighted to be welcoming Suzanne Jabor today from A Lived Experience. Now, Suzanne is somebody who's passionate about helping people to understand and overcome grief, and she's a grief educator. I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion because it's something that we so rarely deal with. And as business owners, it is the thing that we need to deal with because if it's not somebody within our organization, it could well be us that's having to go through something like this. And we just often want to put this away in a shed and hope that it just goes away. And that's not really the right way of dealing with some of these feelings. It really doesn't help the organization, it doesn't help you. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. And Suzanne, really want to welcome you to It's Not Rocket Science 5 Questions Over Coffee. And thank you for spending the time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate, especially people whose work is focused on business, taking the time to talk about this topic because it's so important and it has such a huge impact.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I will tell you that it when my father died, it was a problem for my business for a short while until I eventually learned to overcome it. So I know how it can affect people who are trying to run businesses who are also trying to, as I said, compartmentalize this thing and just ignore it and hope it just goes away, which is just, if that's happening within your organization, it's happening with one of your employees, it's the wrong way of dealing with it. So Suzanne, you've seen this. You've helped people through it. Talk to us about the sort of things that people are doing and how you're trying to help them to educate them on their grief and the way to deal with it.
Yeah, so the thing that's the most important for me is exactly what you're talking about. This kind of whole idea we have that we can put grief in a box, we can just kind of ignore it, we can pretend it's not there and it will eventually go away, is unfortunately not how it works. Really, the only way to get to, I talk about integration being the goal. We want to integrate our grief. It becomes a part of us and a part of our life as we carry forward, which is, I'm sure, what you've done with your dad, right? You haven't left him behind, you haven't moved on or gotten through anything. You've learned how to live with the loss, to carry that grief with you and carry him with you. And what happens at work often is work, many places, is a place where we're not encouraged really to have emotions anyway.
Mhm.
Employers want us to kind of show up and get the job done and, figure out what the problem is, make a plan, solve the problem, move forward. None of that really works with grief. And so if that's your office culture, it can be really challenging for grievers. And if your office culture is more accepting of emotions than that, even then, the really big emotions that happen in grief, which are mostly, to be honest, the ones on that like negative or bad side of the list. If you think about that weird paradigm we have of like positive and good emotions and negative and bad emotions, the ones that we've been taught from our childhoods for most of us to, ignore and not express and, tamp down are the ones that are coming at you in a tsunami when you're in early, especially those early days and those acute days of grief. And for most places, certainly in North America, and I'd love to hear about what it's like for you in the UK, there's kind of a standard 1 to 3 days off. And then you're expected to just show up and be your normal self and get your job done. And, 1 to 3 days is nowhere near as long as it takes. It doesn't even take that year that sometimes we're given grace to. It takes much longer than that for many of us, especially if you've had a really catastrophic loss. Um, and so that sort of sense that you should be able to show up and do your job really does a disservice to everyone because you're then, as the griever, feeling all these expectations that you can't meet, which is then
Mhm.
more grief and loss, right? Because you're already mourning the person you lost. And then if it's someone who the loss of them changed your identity, which is what happened to me, you're mourning yourself, your loss of yourself. And now you're mourning that you don't have these capacities at work that you used to have, but you're supposed, like, it just gets so complicated. So if instead we can have talked about it ahead of time, we can have protocols, we can have developed the skills and mindsets that allow us to at least witness all of those emotions, right, that are coming up, and at least have an open forum where people could talk about them, maybe a quiet place where they could go when they feel overwhelmed, preferably not the bathroom, right? There's many of us that have cried massive tears in a bathroom stall. It's not all that dignified, right? Somewhere quiet to go when you're in overwhelm that's not the bathroom. I love to think about it as like a menu of things you could choose from that you might need support with. And we can talk about, details of that if that's interesting. But what I do with companies is just come in and look at what the culture is around emotion, because that's where we need to start. And I know that's scary, and I know we don't really want to, but it makes us better humans. It makes us better business leaders. It makes us better employers and, customer service providers. And then once we've got to that point where we can maybe have a conversation about grief without feeling like we're terrified and we want to turn and run away, then we can look at, what are the practical things we can do? What might, a lot of companies come to me because they have someone who's important to their team who's had a significant loss, and they realize they want to do something more than like the referral to the employee assistance program, right?
Mm,
That
mm,
referral to sort
mm.
of the 3 free counseling sessions. They know that's not going to be enough, but they don't know what else to do. So that's where
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
step in and really go, okay, great. Let's look at your culture. Let's look at this. If it's based on an individual, let's start there. And then from there, we can make some really robust protocols that people know they can hook into. So the other thing that happens that's really hard for grievers is if there's no conversation that's ever been had in your workplace, there's no protocols in place, you're having to go in the hardest moments of your life to try and advocate for what you need. And that's really a big burden for people. So they tend to not do it because they're in full on survival mode. They can't also go and say, they can't even necessarily identify what's happening to them. So they can't, go and say, well, I'm really having, significant brain fog and I'm struggling with keeping track of my calendar. Could we set up a shared calendar? Like
Yeah,
they can't even
yeah,
articulate any of that because they're in
yeah.
survival mode. But if you, as the boss, the supervisor, the business owner could say, hey, I know you're grieving. Here's our, grief protocol. What of those things would really help you this week? Let's put those into place. And it's an offer that's made as opposed to someone coming to have to ask. That's really powerful. And the ripple of that is that it shows all your other employees who aren't grieving that you care about them, that their whole self is welcome at the office. And if they're struggling with a loss, big or small, or just struggling with something else, they know there's an ability to come and get support. So it
Mhm.
creates that whole culture of support and wholeness that I really think is a big part of, that sort of quiet quitting epidemic and, people showing up and just being barely engaged. If they feel, if people feel seen and heard, then we also want to show up in a really robust way, as best as our capacities are that day. And we know the vast majority of people are doing the best they can in any given day with, the skills and capacities they have. So if we're working from that assumption, then, we can really make real shifts around how we support both our staff and we have customers who are grieving too. So if you have customer facing folks, if that's your business, even if it's business to business, the way that you interact with people who have experienced a loss. I just was talking with a friend the other day who'd experienced a significant loss, and honestly, we're all sharing notes. So I know which companies I will not go to because they didn't have capacity to help him when he needed it, and I know which ones I will. So if you think that grief is not impacting your business, I'm here to tell you you are wrong, because especially right now, coming out of the last 3 years we've all experienced, we all have grief for something, whether we've lost people or multiple people or all the other things we lost, we all have
Yeah.
it. So we need to be talking about it.
Suzanne, that's really it's really interesting and it's exciting to hear you say it. And I guess the question that follows on from that, and we could turn this into 200 questions over coffee. We're not going to.
Right.
I could promise you, but we won't. So I mean, you mentioned it at the end there. What are the things that people are doing wrong? Because you've already sort of said there are things that people are trying to do to sort of overcome this, and it's often a business owner sort of doing something and you think that they have just missed the point or they've just misunderstood or they're trying valiantly to do something but it's
Yeah.
misguided. What are some of the things you've seen that have sort of made you stop and go, no, I really think you need to stop and turn around and go somewhere else?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest one that I hear from grievers is that there's just no support at all. So
Hmm.
they get the sort of, I'm sorry, they might get sent flowers, maybe not. They might get a card, maybe not. All of those things are great. And, we need support beyond that. We need practical
Yeah,
support. We need,
yeah,
some scaffolding to be able to be successful at work. So
yeah,
that's the biggest one, right? Is that the same fear that we feel in our real lives when we're faced with someone who's grieving and we don't know what to do, we don't know what to say, we don't know how to respond. That happens in the workplace. So that's one end of the scale. One end of the scale is they get no support at all. That's a big problem. The other end of the scale is they get support, but it's not what they need. So it's
mhm,
not kind of griever centered. It's happened without a conversation, perhaps. Someone has said, oh, you must be overwhelmed. So let's take this task from you. Well, if you're taking the task that they really like, then now they're left with not the things that they really enjoy at work, or the companies that are trying, that want to help and want to give support, that offer and they take things away or they provide scaffolding, there's no follow-up plan put in place. So I actually
Yeah.
was talking
Yeah.
with one woman who ended up quitting her job and going somewhere else because she had lost a child, so she lost a son, and they provided all kinds of support, really robust support at the beginning, but no follow-up plan to then take that scaffolding down so she could step back into the fullness of her
Yeah.
role. So she
Powerful.
ended up leaving because she became that woman who'd lost a child who everyone had to help. And she didn't
Yes.
want that to be her identity either, right? So it's kind of like from both ends of the spectrum, we kind of go wrong. And really, the key thing, if you can hear anything, is do it all in consultation with the griever
Yeah. Brilliant.
and
Brilliant.
understand that they may not have the capacity, especially in those really acute early days, to articulate or even comprehend what they need. So that's why if you've talked about it ahead of time, I mean, think about what a powerful team building exercise that would be if you had a team meeting where the conversation was, we're all experiencing grief and let's brainstorm, let's talk about, some of the ways we could support each other when we're having those difficult moments or those difficult days.
I
And if
love
you
that.
don't have the skills to do that, then you can bring in someone like me who can easily facilitate that conversation
I love that.
and just get the ball rolling, right? Because
I
then
love
we're
that.
sending all kinds of messages. Like, it's also, as we know as business leaders, right? It's not just about what you say, it's about the messages you're sending. It's about that
Yeah.
idea that we value your whole person and your whole experience. Whatever's going on for you is okay. You're a valued part of this business and we need you. And we need you at the best of your capacity, whatever that is, right?
And
So
I
there's
think
kind of,
particularly,
there's
yeah,
pitfalls both ends of the scale.
yeah, you said something really valuable there that I think, which is the doing these things in advance, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
doing it too late is, and having that conversation before. I think it's absolutely brilliant that you sort of you stress that, because I think that is one of the things that I think. To once again, I don't want to get into too much personal stuff, but there was a situation with me where somebody who was in the process of, they had a terminal condition, and they were starting the grieving process
Hmm.
before the grieving had before the person had left, and
Yeah.
essentially I sort of eventually realized this person was grieving the healthy situation. They were sort of anticipating and sitting going, well, the healthy, what I had before is gone, and everything was rosy. Now I know it's not going to be rosy, and they were grieving that, and then there was going to be a second grief
Yeah.
after the death. And so it was one of those, this is going to be a long-term thing, and the follow-up has to be very, very critical, because they will go through several cycles of feeling good and feeling bad, and things will change, and then it becomes, well, how much longer do we do this, and what do we do in order to sort of return to normality, which is the critical step on that path, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that can take a really long time. Like for me, I came to this work after the death of my son, which now is 2.5 years ago, which is not all that long in the grand scheme of things. But in our sense of how grief works, I should be back to normal,
Mhm.
right? I should be totally fine. Well, of course, that's not the case. I still have capacities that I go, wait, I used to be able to do that and I can't. So that's okay. I can do lots of other things. But that sort of sense of, and in a situation you describe where it's complicated, right? You're having to support someone through anticipatory grief, and then they're going to have the grief when the person finally dies. That person's going to need support for a long time. And you don't want to lose them, right? They're a valued part of your team. So you want to do what you can. And I just want to riff off of something you were saying that, there's a point where like it's kind of too late. I don't actually think that's true. I think you can do a lot of really good mitigating of what you might not have done brilliantly because we all are doing the best we can as we learn new things. So if you're coming out of this conversation today of listening to us and thinking, oh my gosh, I totally blew it with my person who lost someone fairly recently, I'm all about it. Own it. Go to them and say, oh my gosh, I listened to this podcast and I realized I totally didn't support you the way you needed. What can we do now? What support
Brilliant.
do you need
Love it.
now? Right? There's always
Yeah.
time to say, oh my gosh, I didn't know any better. Now I have this inkling I might not have stepped up the way I would have wanted to. Where do we go from here? Right? And that's that vulnerability piece, that honesty piece about we don't know what we don't know until someone says, hey, you don't know that. And then we need to recover. And that's okay.
I love it. I absolutely love that, Suzanne. Thank you. I've just put a message up on the screen for people to say if the questions, and I'm just going to throw this open. And I hope you don't mind, Suzanne, but
Of
even
course.
after this recording is finished, if they've got questions, they can easily post them to you by contacting you on LinkedIn, where you're obviously tagged on this particular episode, or if they need me to contact me, I will then pass them on to Suzanne so that you can actually get those questions answered. So please, don't suffer in silence, as it were. Ask the questions. And I love the advice you've just given, Suzanne, which is, it's never too late to just turn around and own that situation.
Absolutely.
Now I'm just gonna hide that question for a minute. I'm hoping that you've got some valuable free resources that you can talk to us about. It's on your website, which is on screen now, which is alivedexperience.com. So that's a lived experience.com. And I hope I've spelled that right. It's difficult for me to be absolutely sure I've got
It
that
looks right.
absolutely right.
It looks right. I know.
Um,
I realized I picked a really complicated to spell thing. It's all those letters
yes,
that you don't usually type. I'm
I'm
sorry.
it's easy to say, but difficult to get right when you're typing. So,
I know. I
Suzanne,
know.
what have you got on there that could help us to sort of understand a little bit better some of the things that we could be doing as business owners, small business owners, and people who are working together with clients and customers, and also within organizations, so that we can be better grief supporters?
Yeah. So the most important thing that your listeners will find there is a very short, I promise, it's about 6 pages, a little quick ebook. And it's called Grief at Work. So you just look for the Grief at Work ebook. It's in the top banner. Click there. It's about 6 pages of really distilled a starting place, right? So I talk a lot there about some of the symptoms people might be experiencing, really
Mhm.
practical ways that you can support them. The biggest thing for business owners, I think, that impacts people at work is the brain fog. And
Mhm.
if you haven't ever experienced and no one's ever told you about it, it's a thing, and it's a really big thing for a lot of grievers. That sense that just your brain is foggy and you can't remember things, and it's of course linked to sleep deprivation and all our issues with sleeping and eating, and all the things that keep us healthy and whole that we don't do very well in early grief. So that would be the thing to really click on there. And then there's another page that's called Grief at Work that just gives a little brief outline of what I offer as my program. So what I would come into your company and offer you. So that would be the two things. And then if you want to keep digging, my blog posts are all there, so you can learn more about how grief worked for me. And now when I'm doing a blog post, I try and include a section on the bottom with some suggestions and ideas for someone who's grieving, for someone who's supporting them, and then for a business owner. So there's some really rich information there, but I would start with the Grief at Work ebook. That's the place to start.
Brilliant. Thank you, Suzanne, so much. Um, you talked a little bit about how you sort of get into this, and I don't want you to expose too much of that, because I think that's a thing which probably is personal to you. But is there a particular book or course which you think helped you when you were starting your grief journey that you would recommend other people to start using to get through the grief process and help them to understand what they should be doing?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. For me, in those early days of grief, and one of the things I still struggle with is nonfiction comprehension. Like remembering what I've read is still really hard with nonfiction. So I relied really on like Facebook and Instagram posts because they're short and chunky,
Yeah.
and you don't have to read very long. So one of the people's work that helped me really get through those early days is Megan Devine. And her book is It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And she's on Facebook and Instagram. She has a website, email, podcast, all the things. She's really great for those early days. And the other person that has helped me really the most on my grief journey is David Kessler. And that's actually who I did my grief educator course with. I knew that from my own experience, which is how my company ended up with the name it had, I knew my lived experience was going to
Mhm.
be enough for me to be able to help people. And I also wanted to have a foundation in understanding grief in a broader sense and what other people's experiences might be. So I sought out a grief educator course, and I did that with David Kessler, I think he's written 6 books now about grief. His latest book, which is really fabulous once you're out of that kind of survival mode, is called Finding Meaning. And it's all about sort of that sense of post-traumatic growth that we know is possible if we choose it, and if we have the capacity for that. So his most recent book is about sort of how do you integrate that person? How do you find meaning from this experience, from this loss? And that's really helped me a lot, sort of after that first year and a half, 2 years, when I started to really, well, I mean, I looked for meaning right from the beginning because that was going to be my path, my way with grief. But for a lot of people, they don't make that choice then because they're so in survival mode and they just need to get through every day. But once you're ready to kind of look at the broader impacts of that loss in your life, that's a really, really helpful resource. And he also is present on Facebook and Instagram, has a great website, courses, an amazing online support community. So both of those people really helped me a lot.
And Suzanne, I hope we'll find your website and your pages to do exactly the same thing, because I think you're bringing us some real valuable insights here, and I don't want to diminish those in any way. But look,
Thank
we've
you.
covered some interesting ground, but I always finish these interviews with my fifth, and I often admit a get out of jail free question, which means that I don't have to do any work here. Because, this is about you, and I want this to be about you. So there is a question that you must be thinking he hasn't yet asked me. And so now is the opportunity for you to say, the question you really should have been asking me is this, but then of course you obviously have to answer it because otherwise we won't know the answer. So what is that question you would have liked me to have asked, which I've so far failed to do?
I think the question that is the most important to me that we've touched on a little bit is why does it matter? Because I think with this topic that we so are sort of conditioned and enculturated to kind of, turn tail and run away. We're all so scared. We feel so much fear around it. It's really easy for us to think, well, but that doesn't really matter. Like, why does that matter? Why do I need to do this? It's uncomfortable. I don't like it. She's talking about emotions at work. I'm out. Like, I don't want to do this. Why it matters is that these people who are grieving are valuable parts of your team and they're
Mhm.
valued customers. And they're important to your business's success. So everything that I'm talking about, we all want to do because we're most of us on a path of trying to become a better human. The other reason it matters is because this impacts your bottom line. When
Mhm.
you look at the cost of having to do recruitment and interviewing and training and all of that stuff and getting someone up to speed as opposed to retention, it is much cheaper if we're only going to look at it from the bottom line, right? From a business, financial perspective, it is much cheaper to offer short-term, medium-term, long-term scaffolding and support to existing valuable team members than it is to find somebody new. And
Brilliant.
especially in this climate where it feels easier for people to leave and find something else, that just feels like it's shifting a little bit now here anyway, but it's been an employee's market for a long time these last few years. So people seem to feel more able to go, you know what? I've had a shift in my perspective and a shift in what I'm prepared to do at work and what I'm prepared to put up with. And I'm not prepared to put up with this anymore. So it matters because grief gives us an in to talk about some really complicated things that are actually really important for all of us. And the ripple effects that you create, this system of having scaffolding, this system of supports for people who are struggling, a culture where it's expected that sometimes we will struggle and we have all these things in place for when you are, that's a huge shift in culture. And when we shift that culture to having a business where people feel seen and heard and valued, then we're increasing loyalty for our staff
Love
and
it.
our customers. And ultimately, that's what we all want. So
Love it.
that's why it matters.
Love it. Suzanne, that's been what a way to finish. What a way to finish this particular episode. Suzanne, you have educated me. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes on this call with me today. I really appreciate the effort that you've gone to talk to us about this. I will just now be very, very quick and just say, look, if you would like to join the newsletter list and get notification each week of just some of the most brilliant guests that we get on this, so that you can ask them questions during their interview or connect with them afterwards, get onto the website, which is link.thecompleteapproach.co.uk/newsletter. Simple form, fill it out, you get onto the newsletter list. I send you an email once a week which says who's coming on this week, and you get access to be able to talk to some of the most brilliant people I've found on the planet. Suzanne, thank you so much for coming on and spending a few minutes with us. Really do appreciate all the time you spent with us and for some of that really, really educational advice.
Thank you so much for having me. You're so welcome.